The wall clock struck 11, and in that exact moment, Ariana Porter understood that something had slipped out of orbit beneath the polished courtesy that Rivergate Financial Center used as a mask. A white client had barely stepped through the glass doors when the receptionist greeted him with a radiant smile, yet she, the black woman who had once been a strategic advisor for the entire corporation, was left standing there as if she had never existed. This shocking moment was not an accident. It was the invisible blueprint of power unfolding right in front of her. The early summer Seattle breeze brushed against the thick glass, leaving inside the bank lobby a chill so cold it no longer felt like air conditioning but a mixture of distance and disdain. Layers of crystal chandeliers cast sheets of white light over the polished marble floor, making Ariana feel as though she stood on a stage where every movement, every breath was being measured by indifferent eyes that refused to acknowledge her. Her caramel-colored suit fit her tall frame perfectly. Her soft curls were pulled neatly back. Her black, pointed heels clicked sharply with each step, yet all of it only made her stand out more in a place that had no desire to recognize people like her. The receptionist, Lauren Mitchell, her platinum hair styled flawlessly and her voice sweet to the point of artificial, looked at Ariana from head to toe for exactly 1 second before turning away with the practiced indifference of someone who had long decided who was worthy of respect. "Please have a seat. Mr. Kramer will see you shortly." One sentence delivered by protocol, yet containing the entire boundary this bank tried to hide. Ariana set her handbag down and felt as though she herself had also been placed aside. A stressful work day, an important meeting, an appointment confirmed 3 weeks earlier, and now all of it was pushed behind those deemed more appropriate. Each passing minute felt like a shard of glass pressing into her pride. When the clock moved to 11:15, then 11:30, Ariana was no longer waiting for a meeting. She was observing a system built on exclusion, where those who looked the right way, who belonged here, were granted access with a smile, while people like her paid with patience. But there was one thing Rivergate Financial didn't know. Ariana's patience was not weakness. It was the calculated observation of someone who had endured more invisible battles than anyone in that room could imagine. Childhood memories from Boston rose inside her the times she was stopped at store entrances by suspicious glances, the times she was asked to re-verify information simply because she did not resemble the people who usually appeared in upscale financial districts. But those memories did not break her. They sharpened her resolve. And today, as other clients walked past her, like she was an uninvited decoration, that resolve began to stir. While Ariana worked to maintain her composure, the bank lobby continued performing its theater of privilege. A silver-haired man in a grey suit stepped inside, and Lauren immediately stood up, bowed respectfully, and led him through the internal door without hesitation. A blonde woman carrying a Prada bag barely slowed down before being wished a cheerful morning. 2 young men in blue suits laughed, scribbled quick signatures, and were ushered in as though they owned the building. And Ariana, still seated beneath cold crystal light that whispered, "You do not belong here." Her eyes drifted toward the glass doors to Seattle's deep blue sky, where clouds carrying soft sunlight floated slowly. Outside was freedom and brightness. Inside was a reality that made her feel suffocated by unspoken rules. Every click of shoes on the marble floor sent a faint spark of hope through her that someone would call her name, but that hope dissolved piece by piece. By 11:55, Ariana understood. She was no longer waiting for a man named David Kramer. She was waiting for the respect that should never have required asking for. In that moment, amid the freezing hum of the air conditioning and the thick atmosphere of polite discrimination, something ignited inside her. No one has the right to make me disappear. And that spark led to the decision that would shake the entire bank. Without a sigh, without a trace of weakness, Ariana rose to her feet. Her footsteps echoed with the force of a declaration. She was no longer the passive woman, waiting. She was the one walking straight into the heart of their power. Lauren looked up, startled by the strong figure approaching the frosted glass door that led to management. For a split second, panic flashed in the receptionist's eyes, hesitation too. But it was already too late. Ariana did not need permission, because the respect she demanded had nothing to do with being allowed. It had everything to do with being deserved. And the moment her hand touched that glass door, the story shifted from a delayed appointment to a confrontation with an entire system. One small moment, yet powerful enough to tear through the polite mask of Rivergate Financial Center. And this was only the beginning. The frosted glass door leading into the management area opened with a sound so soft it seemed harmless. Yet to Ariana Porter it rang like the crack of an old rule this place never expected to be challenged. Eyes from across the corridor snapped toward her, not because they knew who she was, but because at Rivergate Financial, a client entering the internal zone without an escort was the equivalent of stepping into forbidden territory. Ariana felt each stare clearly shock annoyance, suspicion, even the cold resentment of employees, long accustomed to dividing power by key cards and appropriate faces. But she didn't stop. Her black heels continued tapping steadily across the thick grey carpet, creating a bold rhythm that cut through the tense hallway like a taut string. Nameplates glinted on the doors lining both sides, reflecting the overhead lights like a series of emblems from a system that only opened for those chosen. And today Ariana was not someone chosen, yet she was the one who decided to walk in. Her hand paused for a single second before the office marked David Kramer Branch Manager. Not out of fear, but to contain the anger that had been coiled inside her for hours. When she knocked, the sound echoed like a warning for an inevitable confrontation. David Kramer, 47 years old, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed his grey-blue eyes, always masking the confidence of a man used to making decisions, looked up the moment Ariana entered. In that instant, his expression revealed a blend of surprise, irritation, and impatience, the kind of reaction he usually reserved for a subordinate who broke protocol or a client not important enough to overstep boundaries. "You cannot enter this area on your own," David said, his tone instructional rather than explanatory. Ariana met his eyes, every word slicing clean and sharp. "I have waited for you for 1.5 hours. There was no tremor in her voice, only the resolve of someone who understood her worth and saw exactly how she was being dismissed. David frowned and flipped through the files on his desk, as though proving he was genuinely busy, but the awkwardness in his movements betrayed him. "We have a lot of appointments today. If you could wait a little longer." How much longer? Ariana cut him off, her voice low but icy. "Another hour, 2 more hours for me to keep being treated like I am invisible." David leaned back slightly, his expression shifting from annoyed to defensive. He reached for the safety he knew best, protocol. "We have a priority system for special clients. Sometimes procedures overlap." "Procedures," Ariana repeated, tasting every syllable like she was dissecting a lie polished over years, or personal choices. The air thickened instantly. For a brief moment, David lost the confident armor he wore every day. He looked shaken, unsure whether to deny or redirect, because Ariana's words cut straight into the truth he had always hidden behind the word procedure. Outside the door, footsteps, voices, even the clacking of keyboards fell silent for a moment, as though the entire floor was listening. I am a client. I have an appointment. I arrived on time. I watched at least 5 people without appointments being taken in immediately. So I am asking one simple thing: which procedure is that Ariana's voice was no longer the polished tone of a poised CEO in meetings. It carried the fury of someone who had endured far too many quiet humiliations, each one building into a fire she could no longer contain. David attempted to push back. You are misunderstanding the situation. We do not discriminate here. We only do not say that sentence. Ariana interrupted instantly, her gaze slicing through every layer of pretense. I have heard, we do not discriminate, my entire life. It is always used to cover the truth. A truth he now had no choice but to face. David fell silent. His fingers tightened together, revealing the tension he could no longer hide. For the first time, Ariana saw the powerful man waver on a seat he had long ruled with cold detachment and the unspoken rule of who was worthy. But before she could continue, another sound filled the hallway. The heavy, confident thud of expensive leather shoes echoed down the corridor, a sound that did not belong to any ordinary employee. It carried a kind of authority no one in this branch dared to ignore. The office door swung open. 3 men in navy suits stepped inside, freezing the air in the room. Leading them was Thomas Whitaker, 55 years old, CEO of the entire Rivergate bank system. No one in this branch expected him to appear, certainly not at this moment, not in David's office, and absolutely not to find Ariana Porter standing there like a storm that had come to challenge everything. David's face drained of color. Ariana straightened, and in a single second, with a single glance, the balance of power in the room flipped entirely. Thomas broke into a surprised smile when he saw Ariana, a familiar smile between 2 partners who had worked together in the past. For David, that smile was the first crack in a downfall he no longer had any power to prevent. And the real storm with all the buried truth was only just beginning. The moment Thomas Whitaker stepped inside the small branch manager's office instantly became the epicenter of an invisible earthquake. The air, already tense, shattered into frantic pulses of fear and shock. Thomas, 55 years old, tall with silver at his temples and eyes sharpened by decades of leading a financial empire, stopped the instant he recognized Ariana Porter, standing in the center of the room, not as the renowned partner the corporation once worked with, but as a client who had been dismissed. Ariana, Thomas said, and that single word struck David Kramer like a slap. The tone held no uncertainty, only familiarity, a kind of familiarity David had never anticipated. The 2 board members behind Thomas, Mr. Reed at 62 and Miss Lawson at 50, both tilted their heads at the sound of her name. The shift in their expressions was so quick that David understood immediately they knew who Ariana was, and they knew she was not someone this branch had any right to treat lightly. Ariana turned, folding her anger into a terrifying calm. It was the composure of someone who had negotiated before rooms far more powerful than this one, yet had been treated today as someone unimportant. Thomas crossed the room in 3 long strides, leaving David behind as though he were invisible. He extended a hand with a warm smile. I did not expect to see you here. You are still running Porter Strategies. Yes. Ariana took his hand, her voice, even though her eyes still burned, still running it. And today I came here to complete an appointment. A simple sentence, yet heavy with implications that made Thomas and both board members immediately turn toward David. David froze, his throat tightening, as though squeezed shut. Pieces in his mind snapped together into a deadly truth. The client he made wait for more than 1.5 hours was not an ordinary visitor, but the financial strategist who once advised the digital transformation project of Rivergate's parent corporation. What exactly is happening here? Thomas asked, his voice not loud, but each syllable loaded with pressure. He looked at Ariana, signaling her to speak honestly. Ariana drew a deep breath, gathering every moment of restraint she had endured during the past 1.5 hours into strength. I had an appointment with Mr. Kramer at 11 o'clock this morning. I arrived on time, checked in with the receptionist and I waited until 12:10. Both board members frowned immediately. Thomas kept his eyes on Ariana, calm but razor-sharp. Did anyone inform you of a reason for the delay? No, Ariana replied. I was only told he was in a meeting with no time frame. Meanwhile, multiple clients who arrived later were taken in right away. David opened his mouth, but Thomas raised a hand. It is not your turn. With one sentence, David fell silent, punished in front of the entire leadership. Ariana continued, her voice, not loud, but piercing through every vein in the room. I am not asking for special treatment. I only want to be treated fairly like any client with an appointment. But everything that happened here this morning showed the opposite. A heavy silence dropped like stone. Thomas turned to David, staring directly. Do you have anything to explain? David clasped his hands together, trying to stay composed. But the faint tremor betrayed him. Mr. Whitaker, we had many VIP clients today. I believe there was some overlap in VIP clients. Thomas cut him off, his voice, turning to Steele, who is more important than a strategic partner of the entire corporation. That question nearly made David collapse on the spot. He had never imagined the client he dismissed held such weight in the system. The two board members stepped slightly forward, observing David like examining a flaw in their structure. Ms. Lawson spoke, her voice flat. I would like to know why this branch's client process shows such a clear pattern of selective treatment. This is not the first complaint I have heard from the Seattle region. David's face drained of color. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It had become a systemic issue. But Ariana was not finished. She looked directly at David, her gaze not to punish but to expose. I saw how the receptionist looked at me and how she looked at clients who fit the image this branch seems to think is deserving of priority. I am not saying they voiced discrimination, but their actions spoke clearly. David inhaled sharply, preparing to respond, but Thomas shut it down once more. No, you have said enough. His voice sliced across the room, freezing everything. Thomas turned to Ariana, his tone softening, but no less firm. I sincerely apologize. And I want to hear every detail from beginning to end. Ariana recounted everything from Lauren's cold glance to every client who entered after her, and was greeted with smiles from the long silence to the moment she was forced to walk into the management area, because it had become obvious she had been pushed out of consideration. With each detail, Thomas's expression darkened, and the two board members grew increasingly certain that what happened today was not a small mistake, but the result of a culture warped over many years. Ms. Lawson tilted her head with disappointment. I cannot believe this level of disregard still exists at a flagship branch. Mr. Reed folded his hands behind his back and stared at David. You think a VIP procedure is an acceptable excuse? David dared not answer. Thomas spoke slowly, each word burning. You have allowed this branch to operate according to personal preference instead of the corporation's standards. And you dismissed someone to whom our entire system owes respect. He turned to Ariana, his eyes carrying disappointment in his own organization. You should not have had to experience that. Ariana did not reply immediately. In that moment, though, she maintained her confident posture. A quiet pain flickered in her eyes, the pain of someone reminded yet again that even success status or reputation cannot shield her from subtle discrimination in places that pretend to be civilized. Thomas looked straight at David, his voice decisive. Leave the room. We will speak later. David went pale. He gathered his papers hurriedly and walked out the closing door, echoing like a verdict. As it shut, the balance of power shifted completely. No more avoidance. No more masks. Only 3 senior leaders standing before a woman who had forced them to confront a truth they could no longer deny. And Ariana Porter, the woman forced into silence for nearly 2 hours, was now the only voice the entire system needed to listen to. The conversation that followed would not only decide the fate of a single branch, it would challenge the entire culture of Rivergate Bank. And everything was only beginning. The moment the door closed behind David Kramer, the room sank into a silence so heavy and sharp, it felt suffocating, as if the air itself had begun to rotate around the eye of a storm forming exactly where Ariana Porter sat. Thomas Whitaker pulled a chair toward himself, the motion light but filled with authority, then took a seat across from Ariana, as though preparing to open a formal hearing rather than an emergency meeting. The 2 board members, Reed and Lawson, stood behind him, not bothering to hide the rising anger on their faces. Thomas rested his elbows on the table, fingers interlaced, his voice dropping into a rare, sincere depth. Ariana, I want to hear every single thing that happened from the moment you walked into this branch until the moment you were forced to enter this office. Gone was the raw anger from moments earlier, and when Ariana spoke, her voice carried a quiet steeliness. She recounted everything from the beginning, the way Lauren looked at her, as if sorting her into a category of insignificance. The bright smiles that only appeared for the right kind of clients, the empty, dismissive responses, and the repeated moments where people who arrived after her were ushered in first as if following an unwritten rule. Every detail Ariana revealed carved a deeper crack into the false wall this branch had built to disguise its prejudice. Ms. Lawson leaned toward Reed, her voice lowered, but unable to mask her outrage. I suspected Seattle had issues, but I didn't expect it to be this severe. Reed exhaled heavily, his expression tightening, as if trying to hold back a curse. This is no longer about unprofessional behavior. This is a corrupt culture. Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Ariana. You were ignored even with a formal appointment, and they did it right in front of other clients. Ariana nodded. Do you know what that feels like, to be the only person in a room, treated as though you don't exist? Every passing minute, I did not just feel delayed, I felt judged, filtered out of what they consider appropriate for this environment. Her words were not blame, but the painful admission of someone who had lived this scene too many times before. Thomas fell silent for several seconds, his gaze deepening as though he was staring into a truth he had always known existed, but had never seen so exposed. I am sorry, he said, not as a representative of the corporation, but as one human speaking to another. No one, regardless of who they are, deserves to experience that. Reed cut in his voice, firm, and certainly not you, someone who helped us rebuild the credit scoring system last year. Ariana pressed her lips together, her eyes trembling slightly because hearing that truth only made the injustice feel twice as sharp. The fact that who she was should never have been the measure for how she was treated. The most painful part, Ariana said slowly, is not that I was ignored. It is that their actions were not random. They were consistent, predictable, and treated as normal by everyone in this branch. The atmosphere tightened again. Thomas frowned as if trying to see through every layer of false professionalism the Seattle branch had constructed under the guise of procedure. This is not the first time something like this has happened to you, is it? Ariana met his eyes. No, but this is the first time I chose not to stay silent. Her words shook the room, not in volume, but in weight, the weight of countless lives being quietly diminished by prejudice, while no one spoke up. Thomas drew in a long breath. I want to know exactly who was present while you waited. Ariana listed each one clearly, the elegant couple invited in without verification, the man in the grey suit taken immediately upon arrival, the two young men led in like regular patrons. With each description, Thomas's face darkened. Lawson frowned sharply. None of them had appointments. No, Ariana answered. I saw the appointment screen. My name was on it. None of theirs appeared. Reed let out a bitter, ironic laugh, not directed at Ariana, but at the hypocrisy of the entire system. Incredible. They treat scheduled appointments like optional suggestions instead of commitments. Thomas stood and paced around the table, his eyes flashing with the cold resolve of a leader preparing to make a consequential decision. I will get to the bottom of this, he said, loudly enough for Lawson and Reed to know it was not an empty promise. Then he turned back to Ariana, his expression softening, as though reserved only for her. Ariana, tell me this, when you walked into this hallway, what were you thinking? The question was not light. It opened the door into the deepest part of Ariana's experience. She inhaled softly. I thought if I walked away, I would be letting them win. I would be letting them believe they have the right to decide who deserves access, who deserves to be heard. And I would let another day pass without standing up for myself. The silence that followed was not the suffocating kind from earlier. This time it was the silence of awakening. Thomas looked at Ariana as though seeing a truth he had buried beneath reports and metrics for too long. You were right to walk in here, he said, voice low but resolute. Without that action, we would never have seen what is rotting behind our own walls. Lawson nodded. Your action did not just change an appointment, Ariana. It will change this entire branch. Reed added. And possibly the whole system. Ariana remained quiet, but her eyes no longer burned with anger. Now they carried exhaustion, but also a renewed glimmer of belief, the belief that truth, no matter how deeply buried, can still rise when someone has the courage to pull it into the light. Thomas straightened his voice, returning to the authority of a CEO. From this moment forward, this is no longer a branch-level issue. This is an organizational culture problem. And I promise you, I will not allow it to be buried under any report. He paused for a beat. But before we begin restructuring, there is something more important we must do first. What is it? Ariana asked. Thomas looked at her, a slow but determined smile forming like a sealed vow. Restoring justice for you. And in that moment, Ariana knew the battle she never intended to ignite had become the fire that would force an entire system to confront itself. But that fire was only beginning to burn. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, and what came next would mark the arrival of the first real consequences. Footsteps in the hallway grew louder, striking in a steady, heavy rhythm like hammers hitting red-hot steel, tightening the air in the meeting room until it felt as though it might crack. Thomas Whitaker turned toward the door, his sharp gaze alone enough to make any employee outside hesitate. But the person who entered was not David returning, nor Lauren being summoned, but the branch's senior administrative assistant, a middle-aged woman named Harriet Noble, known for her discipline and discretion. Harriet stood straight at the doorway, her eyes flicking briefly toward Ariana, before she bowed her head slightly. "My apologies for the interruption, Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice respectful but trembling. "You requested the appointment log for today. I have brought it." She handed over the stack of papers, her hand shaking as though she understood that any document placed in Thomas's hands at this moment could determine someone's fate. Thomas took it without another glance at her, his eyes already scanning the pages like a judge reviewing evidence, moments before delivering a verdict. Lawson and Reed leaned in, reading over his shoulder. Ariana, though prepared, felt her heartbeat intensify as she saw the printed list of appointments and their corresponding times. Thomas flipped through the pages, each turn peeling away another layer of the falsehood the branch had been hiding. He stopped at 11 o'clock. The line was printed clearly, Ariana Porter, consultation. Meeting with branch manager. Below it, the next time slots read 11:15 empty, 11:30 empty, 11:45 empty, even 12 o'clock still empty. Yet according to Ariana, the lobby had been full of clients entering and exiting, all being taken in before her. Thomas flipped to the final pages where special VIP exception cases would normally be listed. The entire VIP section was blank, completely blank. None of the names Ariana had seen being ushered in appeared. No fabricated Barbara Lancaster, no important investors, no exceptions of any kind. Lawson's eyes widened. There is not a single approved VIP priority today. Reed tapped his fingers sharply against the table, meaning everyone Lauren brought inside was her own decision. Thomas said nothing, but his clenched jaw revealed the fury sharpening beneath his restraint. Harriet stood beside them, sweat forming at her temples, as she waited to be dismissed or questioned. Ariana looked at the file, then at the three highest-ranking leaders of the bank, each displaying a different shade of reaction. Thomas's jaw locked in outrage, Reed burning with anger, Lawson radiating profound disappointment. As the silence grew so heavy, it felt capable of suffocating the room, Ariana finally spoke. Her voice was gentle, but cut like the edge of a blade, slicing straight into the heart of the matter. This is not confusion between VIPs and regular clients. This is a personalized system of favoritism. Favoritism built on faces, skin tone, and assumptions about who belongs. Thomas snapped the file shut. The sound was a verdict. He turned to Harriet. "Bring receptionist Lauren to this room. Now." Harriet froze for a fraction of a second, eyes widening, then bowed her head and hurried out. No one in the room spoke, because all of them understood that the moment Lauren walked through that door, it would not be a conversation. It would be a reckoning. The waiting stretched thin, like a drawn violin string. Ariana inhaled slowly, not because she sought vindication, but because she was about to witness the invisible become visible. Lauren entered. Her blonde hair immaculate, her outfit pristine, her face attempting composure, but her eyes betrayed the panic building beneath her professionalism when she saw the CEO of the corporation, 2 board members, and Ariana Porter seated across from her. Ms. Lauren Mitchell-Thomas began, his voice steady but freezing cold. "I want you to explain why a client with an appointment at 11 o'clock," he pointed to Ariana, "was left waiting nearly 2 hours in the lobby." Lauren swallowed hard. "I was informed Mr. Kramer was in a meeting," and a meeting, Thomas repeated with a tone that required no answer. He glanced at Lawson. Lawson lifted the document. "According to records from 10:45 to 12 o'clock, Mr. Kramer did not attend a single meeting. Additionally, internal logs show no VIP priority requests from him or from the system." Lauren turned pale. Ariana recognized the moment instantly, the moment when behaviors Lauren considered harmless habits morphed into undeniable evidence. Thomas continued, his voice stern enough to silence every breath in the room. "Can you explain why clients who arrived later with no appointments were escorted inside ahead of Ms. Porter?" Lauren bit her lip, her eyes darting toward Ariana, as though hoping to find some excuse to cling to. "They were familiar clients of the branch. I thought I assumed they were more important." "So you assumed," Reed interjected, his voice sharp as steel, "you assumed certain clients looked more important. Clients who dressed upscale, clients who were whiter." Lauren stammered. "No, I didn't. I don't discriminate." Ariana watched her, feeling not a triumph, but a deep sadness, because she had witnessed this pattern far too many times, bias followed by denial, as if the denial could erase the truth. Thomas cut her off. "You do not need to say another word. Everything is already clear." Lauren stood frozen, unable to move. Thomas turned to Ariana, his tone shifting to respect. "Ariana, is there anything you want to add before we make our decision?" Ariana inhaled, then spoke, not for herself, but for everyone who had ever experienced what she had experienced. "I do not need a personal apology. I want assurance that anyone who walks into this branch, no matter what they look like, will not be treated as though they are unworthy of being served. Fairness is not a favor. It is a standard." The room fell silent. Not the silence of fears this time, it was the silence of truth laid bare under the light. Thomas stood. "Thank you, Ariana." He looked at Lawson and Reed. "Ms. Lawson, prepare to suspend Lauren Mitchell pending investigation. Mr. Reed, notify corporate HR. And call an emergency meeting with all branch managers in the region tonight." Lauren's knees buckled slightly, as if she could not believe what she was hearing, but Thomas continued unwavering. "Rivergate does not exist to become a monument to privilege, and if any branch turns fairness into a tool for selecting who is worthy, that branch will be rebuilt from the ground up." He then turned back to Ariana, his voice softening with conviction. "You did the right thing. And because of you, the wrongdoing has finally come to light." In that moment, Ariana no longer felt like someone fighting for her own dignity. She had become the person forcing an entire system to confront itself. And for the first time, the system could not turn away. The investigation was only beginning. Yet the power of truth, spoken at the right moment in the right room, had already cracked the foundation of Rivergate's injustice, and Ariana knew that from this moment on, no one in that room would ever return to the comfortable silence of before. Right after Lawson recorded the temporary suspension of Lauren and Reed, sent an urgent message to corporate HR, the atmosphere in the room shifted into something heavier, yet more decisive, as though the entire space had entered the next phase of a surgical procedure, the phase where damaged cells are forced into the light. Thomas Whittaker planted both hands on the table, lowered his head for a few seconds, as if gathering every ounce of composure before saying what needed to be said. Then he lifted his gaze, looking at Ariana with absolute seriousness. "Now we need to address the larger issue," he said slowly. "Not just Lauren, not just Kramer, but the entire way this branch operates." Reed nodded firmly. "I want the lobby camera footage from 10 o'clock to 12 noon. Every interaction, every conversation. Who was brought into the meeting rooms, who was welcomed, who was ignored," Lawson added. "And I want a full list of every client who walked in today, cross-referenced with timestamps and system records. We will know immediately whether this was individual misconduct or a long-nurtured culture of preferential treatment." Ariana stayed silent, but inside she felt something shift, not satisfaction, but the realization that a door once permanently shut was now open, and nothing would be able to close it again. Thomas looked at Harriet, who was still standing near the door, tension clinging to her like a shadow. "Bring me the reception system activity log from this morning," he said. "Who logged in? Who approved what? Who accessed the VIP list? I want everything on this table within 5 minutes." Harriet bowed and hurried out. When the door closed, Thomas leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply. "Ariana," he said, the edge in his voice softened, but still waited. "I need to ask you something that is not easy to hear." Ariana tilted her head, slightly bracing herself. Thomas asked, "When you walked into this branch, was there a moment when you already sensed this would happen?" The question, simple on the surface, cut into layers of unhealed memories built from decades of living in a world where other people's eyes often dictated her place. Ariana closed her eyes for a second. "Yes," she said, quietly, almost like an admission. "I recognized that look. The look that says, 'I do not belong here.' The look that says, 'I am not the type of person they expect to see in a place of power like this.'" Lawson fell silent. Reed clenched his fists, restraining his rising anger. Thomas froze for a moment. He understood not because he had lived it, but because he had witnessed people like her being treated as if they were merely intruders wandering into the wrong room. "And when they made you wait," Thomas continued, "did you think it was because they saw you as less than them?" Ariana met his gaze, steady and unwavering, with no desire left to soften the truth. "I did not think," she said. "I knew." Reed let out a sharp breath. Lawson pressed one hand to the table. Thomas lowered his head for several seconds, then lifted it again, with an expression transformed no longer unsure or defensive, but filled with ironclad resolve. "I will never let this happen again," he said, each word weighted like metal. "Not in Seattle. Not in any branch we operate." Harriet returned at that moment, carrying a stack of freshly printed papers and a tablet displaying system logs. Thomas scanned them quickly like someone who had reviewed thousands of reports, but this time every small entry contributed to a much larger and uglier truth. The screen showed the access history Lauren had logged into the system 8 times between 10 o'clock and 12 noon, yet not once opened Ariana's file, even though her name was first on the list. Instead, she repeatedly accessed Visitor Access Manual Approval, where she manually added the names of walk-ins. Thomas clenched his jaw. She prioritized everyone except the one person with a legitimate appointment. Not only that, Lawson said, pointing at the 5th line, she marked them as familiar clients. But the system's familiar client verification shows no record of them whatsoever. Reed gave a short, bitter laugh. Familiar in the sense of personal bias, or familiar because they looked right. Not familiar by data. Thomas slammed his hand on the table not loudly, but with enough force to make all three people flinch, and even Ariana sit straighter. "This is the collapse of standards," he said, his voice cutting through the room. "If a branch gives itself permission to create its own rules based on personal judgment instead of fairness, then that branch is no longer a Rivergate branch." Ariana watched all of this with a mixture of calm and quiet ache. "I do not expect the world to change in a day," she said softly, "but I do expect a bank, a major financial institution, to know how to treat the people who walk through its doors fairly." Thomas looked at Ariana as though seeing in her a mirror of everything he had avoided confronting sooner. "You will have that," he said. "And not just you." He turned to Lawson and Reed. "The moment we leave this room, I want a complete report on discriminatory client treatment across the entire Western region for the past 3 months. No softening, no omissions, no excuses." "You will have it," Lawson replied. "Today." "I also want to speak with the training department," Thomas continued. "Not about holding a diversity and inclusion session just for show, but about designing a foundational reform. We will teach employees how to recognize unconscious bias, how to see people instead of appearances, and how to respect every client without conditions." Reed nodded. "And we need a stricter disciplinary framework. We cannot allow people like Kramer or Lauren to repeat their actions under the shield of procedure." Thomas turned to Ariana. "Would you be willing to help us design that program? Your insight would be invaluable." Ariana froze for a second, surprised by the question. But then she understood something. The path she was on was no longer about winning a personal battle. It was a path for those who would come after her. "I will," she said. "Not for myself, but for the people sitting in the lobby tomorrow." Thomas smiled faintly, a rare expression after such an intense stretch of time. "Then we begin today." In that moment, the conversation ceased to be about a branch, an incident, or a client who had been ignored. It became the rebirth of a culture. And Ariana knew that although the road ahead would be long and difficult, today marked the first step in breaking through the invisible wall that so many had run into before quietly walking away. But she didn't walk away, and because of that, Rivergate would never be the same again. Outside the meeting room, the usually quiet hallway of the Rivergate Financial Center's management wing had grown so heavy that every footstep echoed like a warning of an approaching storm. Anyone walking past lowered their voices, tense whispers drifting through the air like fine dust. They did not know the details of what was unfolding inside the large conference room, but they knew one thing never before had the CEO of the corporation and 2 board members arrived at the Seattle branch in the middle of the day, and certainly never before had they summoned multiple employees with expressions resembling a tribunal. Inside, Ariana Porter remained seated back, straight fingers interlaced on the table, though her palms still felt warm from the adrenaline that had not fully subsided after hours of confrontation. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction. The only thing she felt was the weight of the truth. Truth she had carried into this room, not to bring down one person, but to expose a system decaying from within. Thomas Whitaker sat at the head of the table, eyes scanning the list of senior staff members that Harriet had just delivered. He did not read in detail, only skimmed the names, but Ariana sensed that in his mind, the operational structure of this branch was collapsing layer by layer. "We need to speak with Kramer again," Thomas said, not angry, but in the firm tone of a man preparing to reset the entire board. We cannot address this at the receptionist level without addressing management." Harriet left immediately, and moments later, a sharp knock sounded. David Kramer entered, looking like a man who already knew the verdict waiting for him, but still clung to a thin strand of hope that perhaps it was not too late. He avoided Ariana's gaze, avoided Lawson and Reed, but when his eyes met Thomas's, he reacted like someone watching the water rise to his throat. "Sit," Thomas ordered. David stood frozen a second too long before lowering himself into the chair, back hovering inches from touching it, as though he no longer had the right to lean. Thomas slid the appointment sheet across the table toward him. "Explain." David swallowed hard. "Sir, I did not realize the receptionist kept Miss Porter waiting that long. If I had known you knew Ariana, cut in her voice, calm but sharper than any accusation. You walked into the lobby twice while I waited. I saw you. You saw me." David's face turned ashen. He glanced at Thomas, silently pleading, but Thomas remained still, waiting for the only person in the room who had the right to describe what truly happened. Ariana. "Mr. Kramer," she continued, "I am not upset because you were busy. Busy people know how to say one polite sentence or ask staff to give an update, but you did neither. You walked past me as if I were an empty chair." David opened his mouth to defend himself, but Ariana spoke again, before he could arrange a lie even he might believe. "It was not because you were busy," she said. "It was because you did not think I mattered." Reed stepped in, voice cold enough to freeze the air. "Is she right?" David said nothing. And that silence was worse than any confession. Lawson stepped forward slightly, unable to tolerate another second of dishonesty. "We reviewed the reception system logs," she said. "There was no directive from you to delay her appointment, no VIP approvals. Everything was decided by the receptionist or by your indirect influence." David placed both hands on the table, as though trying to hold on to the last fragments of authority. I just trusted my staff to know who our priority clients are." Thomas stared at him, as though listening to a confession, more damning than any accusation. "Based on what criteria?" David said. "Nothing." His silence stretched too long, and in that silence, everyone understood he had no criteria. He had bias. Thomas leaned forward. "I will ask again, based on what criteria?" David opened his mouth, then closed it again, his lips trembling slightly. Finally he whispered, "Based on experience, who our familiar clients are, who looks trustworthy." The answer, quiet as a draft slipping through a doorframe, hit the room with the force of an explosion. Ariana did not frown, did not shake her head, did not show anger, because she had lived her entire life in a world where looks trustworthy was the unspoken filter used to push her aside. But hearing it spoken aloud sent a chilling clarity through the room. Lawson turned to Thomas, fury clear in her expression. "This is explicit discrimination, based on subjective appearance." Reed added, "And it is not the first time. No one becomes this bold in bias unless it has become a habit." Thomas pushed his chair back and rose with the decisiveness of someone who had finally seen enough to tear down a rotten wall. "David Kramer," he said, "you are suspended effective immediately. A formal investigation will begin this afternoon. And let me be clear, if we find any evidence of systematic discriminatory conduct, I will make sure you do not hold a management position in this industry for even one more day." David bowed his head, his shoulders trembling, not from injustice, but because he knew he had been exposed. When he left the room, the air seemed to release a long-held breath, as though years of dust had finally been blown out of the corners. But Ariana did not watch him go. She looked at Thomas Lawson, and Reed, feeling a quiet current of electricity move between the people standing before her. Thomas turned to her, his gaze more sincere than ever. "Thank you for not leaving when they tried to make you disappear." Ariana replied, her voice soft but steady. "I did not stand up to embarrass them. I stood up because too many people have stayed silent." Lawson nodded gently, her eyes glistening. Reed added, "And because of you, we can no longer pretend we do not see what has been happening in this entire system." Thomas gathered the documents on the table, his voice turning resolute. "Ariana, I promise you this. The truth spoken today will not be forgotten. It will become the foundation for change." And in that moment, under the bright white lights of the room, Ariana realized that sometimes it only takes one person brave enough to voice what everyone has grown accustomed to ignoring for an entire system to stop, look inward, and begin again. But the fight was far from over. The next chapter would not merely be about disciplining wrongdoing. It would be about rebuilding a culture from the ashes of truth. The door closed behind David Kramer, but the sound echoed like the lid of a coffin, sealing shut on an old form of power that had lingered far too long without ever being challenged. In that moment, the room seemed to change atmosphere entirely, no longer heavy with concealment, but strangely clear, as if truth itself had just flung the windows open and swept away years of accumulated dust. Ariana Porter remained still, yet inside her something was shifting, like the weight of countless moments of being dismissed throughout her life was slowly being lifted piece by piece. And in the eyes of Thomas Whitaker Lawson and Reed, she saw something more profound than apology, recognition, accountability, and the understanding that one courageous voice could illuminate the dark corners a system had long ignored. "Now is the time we repair this," Thomas said, first, his voice low but firm, like a command. "Not just the mistakes of today, but the rules that allowed today to happen." He sat again at the head of the conference table, but this time he was no longer a distant CEO. He was a leader confronting the failures of his own institution. Reed nodded, his face tightened in sharp calculation. "I reviewed the client handling records for the Pacific Northwest region. Several branches operate well, but Seattle, I suspect, this is not the first incident." Lawson added, "Bias based on appearance, ethnicity, or perceived social status never exists in isolation. It always grows from culture. And if the culture does not change, the misconduct will repeat." Her words swept through the room like a strong wind, clearing the remnants of the confrontation, and making Ariana realize she had not simply confronted two individuals. She had confronted a mindset that had silently taken root in many places. Thomas turned the papers in front of him, then looked at Ariana as if he wanted something more important than data or evidence. "Ariana, I want to understand from your perspective. If you could rebuild Rivergate's client service process from scratch, where would you start?" The question was so unexpected that Ariana nearly stopped breathing, not because she lacked an answer, but because no one had ever asked her before. Her entire career had required her to adapt to someone else's process. No one had ever asked how she would design a process that treated everyone with dignity. She inhaled, then said slowly, "I would start with training, but not the diversity and inclusion sessions you use to make reports look good. I mean, training that helps employees understand their own unconscious bias, training that teaches them to recognize when they are judging people by appearance instead of by truth. Lawson tapped the edge of the table lightly, signaling deep agreement. "Go on," she urged. Ariana continued, her voice growing steadier, as thoughts she had held quietly for years finally found their way into the open. "I want every branch to record the entire client handling process in a transparent system. Client name, time of arrival, staff member responsible, who gets priority, why, no more assumptions, no more subjective impressions," Reed wrote rapidly, his eyes brightening at the clarity, practicality, and precision of her proposals. "And lastly," Ariana said, pausing before expressing the most important point, "I want every employee to understand that they do not represent just a branch. They represent the human values every client deserves." A deep silence settled over the room, replacing the earlier tension with thoughtful reflection, as though everyone present realized they were witnessing a genuine turning point. Thomas stood and walked slowly around the table, as if weighing every word she had spoken. Then he stopped beside her, his eyes filled with a sincerity that made Ariana feel something warm swell in her chest. "You know," Thomas said, quietly, "it has been a very long time since someone at Rivergate spoke so directly about an issue that many leaders lacked the courage to face." He placed his hand lightly on the back of her chair, bowing his head slightly. "I want to invite you to become a senior advisor for our client experience cultural reform program." Ariana froze, not in shock, but at the magnitude of what his words represented. It was not just an offer. It was an affirmation that her voice had grown beyond the role of a client seeking justice. It had become a voice for change. "I am not sure I can," Ariana whispered. Thomas shook his head immediately. "You can. Not because you once worked with us, but because you understand this issue from a perspective very few people ever will," Lawson added, "and without people who have lived through injustice guiding us, we will only keep creating policies on paper, policies no one believes in." Reed concluded in his familiar firm tone. "You are not just speaking for yourself, Ariana. You are speaking for many." Their words washed over Ariana like a warm current melting away years of being scrutinized, doubted, or overlooked. But before she could answer, Harriet knocked again and entered her face, tense, yet no longer trembling. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "we have reviewed the lobby camera footage." Thomas folded his arms, and Harriet looked at Ariana before replying as though ashamed on behalf of the entire branch. 14 clients arrived after Ms. Porter and were escorted inside ahead of her. None of them appeared in the appointment list. The number 14 struck the room like a blow to the chest. Ariana closed her eyes for a brief moment, releasing the final weight of the humiliation she had endured from 11 o'clock to nearly 1 in the afternoon. Thomas nodded. He did not need to hear anything more. "Thank you, Harriet. Please make copies of all video files and send them to corporate HR." Harriet bowed and left. Thomas turned to Ariana, speaking slowly, decisively. "You see, even the numbers stand with you." Ariana looked down at her hands, then up at the 3 leaders who were here, not to protect the system, but to expose it. "In that case," she said, her voice soft, but carrying a new resolve, "I will accept." A rare smile appeared on Thomas's face, not the smile of a man who had won, but of a man who had found hope. "Then we will change Rivergate," he said, "starting today." And in that moment, under the cold white lights of the conference room, Ariana realized that sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to step through silence, to force an entire institution to kneel before the truth and rise again on a new foundation fairness. But the road ahead would be long, and the greatest challenge still awaited, not changing through promises, but through action. When the tense meeting finally came to an end, Thomas Whitaker rose and walked around the table as though closing a dark chapter in the history of Rivergate, Seattle. He extended his hand toward Ariana Porter, not the practiced handshake of the financial world, but a gesture of genuine respect for the woman who had forced an entire system to wake up. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for not staying silent." Ariana grasped his hand, feeling his sincerity, but also something else, the quiet release spreading through her chest, like a breath she did not realize she had been holding for far too long. The long battle fought in silence over years, through experiences, through scrutinizing glances, now dissolved into echoes. But it was not over yet. Reed and Lawson approached, and Lawson spoke in a low, soft tone. "Ariana, today, you did not confront a branch. You confronted a system, and you won." Ariana said nothing, but her eyes carried what words did not need to express. She did not seek victory. She sought fairness. And today, it had finally begun to open. Thomas turned to Reed and Lawson. "We will hold an emergency meeting with the entire region tonight. I want every branch to understand that this kind of behavior is no longer acceptable." Lawson wrote it down and nodded. Reed typed a quick message on his phone, his expression serious. "I will have HR issue an official statement before 5 o'clock this afternoon." Then Thomas turned back to Ariana. "But before you leave, I want to personally ensure one thing: your loan file will be approved today." He did not say it as compensation, but as a restoration of the fairness that should have been upheld from the beginning. Ariana nodded, though she did not smile, not because it was unimportant, but because something else mattered more: the stitching back together of trust inside her piece by piece. Harriet entered again, calmer than before, carrying the loan approval forms. Thomas reviewed them quickly, signed and stamped them right in front of Ariana. "You will not spend another minute waiting for something meaningless," he said. Ariana took the documents, but her heart drifted not toward the paper, but toward the frosted glass door at the end of the hallway, the one she would walk through again in just a few minutes. And then the moment arrived. Ariana stood, gathered her things, and as she reached the door, Thomas suddenly spoke. "Ariana, when you step out there, remember that everyone in this room stands with you." His words became an invisible shield. Ariana offered a small smile, bowed her head in gratitude, and stepped out. The hallway outside was quieter than before, but it was no longer the silence of indifference or judgment. It was the silence of change. Employees passing by slowed their steps, some glancing away in shame, others giving her a subtle nod of acknowledgement. But nothing Ariana saw felt heavy anymore. Instead, it felt like walking through a landscape freshly cleared after a storm. When she neared the reception desk, Lauren Mitchell sat there, shoulders drawn tight, her eyes trembling the moment they met Ariana's gaze. The icy confidence, the hollow smile of someone who believed she had the right to decide who was worthy of respect, none of it remained. Now she was simply a person facing the consequences of her own actions. Ariana said nothing. She simply looked at Lauren, not with hatred, not with superiority, but with truth. A truth Lauren could no longer escape. Lauren bowed her head, her hands clasped tightly together, as though she too understood that this moment was the first step toward relearning how to see people, Ariana walked past her, the soft tap of her shoes on the stone floor, like the steady rhythm of someone who had crossed a chasm without losing her dignity. The glass doors slid open, letting sunlight pour in, warm, bright, expansive, so radiant that Ariana felt as though she were stepping out of a room, cold not only in temperature, but in principle. She stepped onto the front steps and inhaled deeply the scent of Seattle's wind, mixing with coffee and damp earth after last night's rain. Down on the sidewalk, life continued, people walking, living unaware that, on the third floor of the Rivergate building, an entire system had been forced to stop and confront itself. Ariana's phone buzzed. A new email. She opened it. "Your loan has been approved." "Congratulations," Ariana smiled, but the smile was not for the loan. It was for herself, for the courage that kept her in the lobby at 11 o'clock, that kept her from leaving at 11:30, that refused silence at 12, that stood tall at 12:15, and that did not break when the system tried to make her invisible. Now, as sunlight settled on her shoulders, Ariana knew more clearly than ever she had stepped out of the shadows, not only for herself, but for those who would come after her. And this journey, which began with a senseless weight, had become a reminder that sometimes a single act of bravery is enough to awaken an institution once believed to be unshakable. The Seattle afternoon filtered warm, golden light through layers of grey clouds, stretching long shadows across the glass facade of the Rivergate Financial Center, where the confrontation from that morning still sent silent tremors through floors that had yet to regain their usual rhythm. But outside, Ariana Porter walked with the steady composure of someone who had just reclaimed ownership of her own narrative, as if every step she took reaffirmed a truth she no longer doubted. Respect was not something she had to ask for. It was something she deserved. The city's chaotic sounds, car horns, footsteps on the pavement, voices calling to one another under the street trees, now sounded different, like a vibrant symphony that stood in complete contrast to the cold silence she had endured all morning inside the bank. Ariana stopped at the corner, looking up at the towering glass building, where for the first time that day, her reflection stared back at her in full clarity, upright, composed, no longer clouded by even a trace of self-doubt. She realized the most important part of what had happened was not that she had won an argument. It was that she had forced a massive institution to face itself. And that kind of power was not something a title, a status, or a privilege could create. Only courage could. As Ariana walked into the parking structure, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Thomas Whitaker. "You taught us a lesson today that even regional directors could not teach. Thank you. And be ready for the reform. We need you." Ariana let out a soft laugh, not out of pride, but because she recognized a profoundly human truth. Sometimes real power does not rest in the hands of those seated at the biggest tables, but in the hands of those who dare to say what no one else will. As she pulled out of the parking lot, a breeze from Elliott Bay swept across the street, cool and wide, like the new possibilities unfolding ahead of her. A bicycle raced past. A student waved at someone. A woman pushed a stroller. A delivery worker hurried toward his next drop-off. And Ariana suddenly thought of all these ordinary people, people who had to walk through doors every day that others often believed they did not belong behind. She thought of the looks she had endured so many times, the looks that silently asked, "Are you sure you belong here?" And she knew every one of those people deserved the same chance to be seen and heard that she had received today. Their battles would not be exactly like hers. but Ariana hoped that the steps she took today would create a small opening, a narrow shaft of light, showing them that they too had the right to claim their space. She drove through the amber-lit streets, feeling a lightness inside her, as though she had shed a heavy coat she had worn for years. She remembered sitting alone in the waiting area at 11:20, the moment she felt swallowed by a crowd that had been granted unearned priority over her. That memory no longer hurt. It had become a marker in her journey, a reminder that the silence of that moment had given birth to the change happening now. But the larger transformation was happening behind Rivergate's glass walls. On the 3rd floor, Thomas and the 2 board members had begun a meeting with the regional managers. The screen displayed the stern faces of each branch leader, and Thomas addressed them like speaking to an entire battalion. Starting today, client priority procedures must be absolutely transparent. No more unreasonable flexibility. No more personal preference. We will become a bank where anyone feels safe walking through our doors. On the 2nd floor, Harriet was gathering data from the last 3 months, and for the first time in years, she realized she was no longer just a keeper of procedures. She had become someone tearing away the layers of bias she had unknowingly accepted as normal. On the 1st floor, Lauren Mitchell sat alone in a small meeting room, awaiting HR, her eyes red, but reflecting something Ariana could never have predicted: remorse. Not everyone would change, but some would. And that change always began with facing oneself. From the outside, Rivergate Financial Center still shimmered like it always did. But inside, the gears of power had begun to turn in a new direction. New rules were being written, and the legacy of one seemingly ordinary morning was being etched into the bank's history. As Ariana stopped at the final red light before reaching her office, she looked toward the gleaming water in the distance and smiled a smile, not for the past, nor for what she received today, but for what lay ahead. Because she knew the battle she had begun would not end with Rivergate. It would travel with her to every place she set foot in, and it would remain with anyone who dared to reclaim their own voice. Because sometimes all it takes is one person saying enough and the whole world must listen. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture and human behavior, the journey of Ariana Porter reveals a truth that has never changed. Even the most seemingly unshakable systems can crumble because of a single timely voice from someone brave enough to rise. Discrimination does not always appear in harsh words. It often hides in glances, in unjustified favoritism, and in rules quietly bent by personal bias. Yet it is precisely moments like the ones Ariana faced that spark turning points, forcing an entire institution to confront itself and rebuild from the ground up. If this story resonates with you, please like to spread the message of fairness and courage, and subscribe so you do not miss other journeys where one individual dares to challenge an entire system. And comment the phrase Jung Len to remind each other that sometimes one small action is enough to change everything.